And before we start, I just want to pass the word to Dr. Mona Gleason, the head of the UBC Educational Studies Department. Thank you, Mona, for being here.
Thank you so much. I'm really pleased to see everyone's faces. I haven't seen in a little while, so it's wonderful. So welcome to our virtual research day. When plans began for this day sort of months ago, who could have anticipated that the world would find itself in the spot that it's in? But here we are. If we had had a face-to-face meeting at UBC, of course, we would have acknowledged our presence on the unceded, ancestral, and traditional territory of the Musqueam people. But scattered around the city and perhaps around the world, indeed, as we are today, I think we really need to rethink whose land is occupied and with whom we need to engage in both truth-telling and in efforts at reconciliation. So in my case, here in East Van, I offer my gratitude to the Coast Salish people, Squamish, Stolo, Tsleil-Waututh, and Musqueam nations. As we navigate a pretty restricted relationship with the world around us, the critical importance of being able to go outside, to take some comfort from the spaciousness of the natural world and to experience that kind of freedom that it offers has come home to us, I think, in new ways. The crisis has made us think about what we value, who we are, what we need to be happy, and what we can do without. And it makes us reflect, I think, on our incredible privileges in light of what others around the world are enduring right now. So I'm very mindful of that as well as we come together in this communal space. The reality of this crisis is that it really forces us to think about what we take for granted. And I've been really reminded of that in my own life. So being able to see each other casually in the hall or in the kitchen, in Oak House, and perhaps in so doing, rethinking what we take for granted. We have this opportunity, perhaps it's naive, but we have this, in my mind, this opportunity to somehow press a reset button, or that's a possibility, I think. So what is it that we should pay more attention to? What changes brought on by this health crisis should remain in place? Recognition of the need for, indeed, the demand for economic and social justice that has become even more shrill. Recovering ecosystems around the world. These are some positive outcomes associated with what is otherwise a really horrible threat to human life around the world. So what lessons will we learn from this, if any? It's kind of preoccupying me these days. What we can be certain of is that research into all aspects of the COVID crisis will be a major part of our landscape going forward for years, if not decades. So it's interesting to think about that. I don't know how many of you are keeping a journal these days, but it will be valuable testimony to how people encountered the crisis. So despite our challenging circumstances, I'm really delighted to kick off our research day, and I'm really grateful to our GAAs, to Allison, Yotam, Vanessa, Maria, Angelica, for persevering with the idea that we hold this day online. When it first sort of happened, I was kind of like, but I'm actually really happy that they calmed me down and sort of, showed the pathway to doing this. And my thanks also go out to Andre as our grad advisor, who's provided support and guidance the whole way along. So just want to offer my sincere thank you. We need to find ways to stay connected. This is especially true now, and seeing each other and listening to each other talk about our scholarship is really strong connective tissue for us. It binds us together in ways that allows us to get out of our own heads, and that might be even more important these days. It allows us to think about things we may not have considered, to think about them differently, to forget, maybe only for a little while, this strange reality that we're in. So by supporting each other through events like Research Day, we affirm our collegial commitment to each other and to the importance of research as a means of interrogating and perhaps even improving the world. So I want to extend my gratitude to those students and faculty who are presenting today. We have 6 concurrent sessions with topics ranging from activism in politics and education to philosophical and historical studies, and a lot in between there, including our keynote speakers. So I'll now in a sec just turn the hosting duties over again to Maria Angelica. And as I do, I just want to send my best wishes to everyone. I hope you're all well and doing the best you can in the midst of very difficult circumstances. And I'm particularly mindful of those who have family and friends outside of BC and outside of Canada. There's a sense of helplessness that can sort of envelop us, and oftentimes all we can do is surrender to it. So we're all together in that in many ways. So onward with Research Day. I hope you enjoy the papers. I look forward to seeing you all in person one day soon. So enjoy the day.
Thank you, Mona. Just for the folks that are just joining, we want to alert all audience members that we will now be starting to record the keynote session. The recording will end once the keynote is complete, and it will be made available publicly on the EDST website. So you will get some information about that when it's ready. And now I want to welcome Dr. Kathryn Accurso. She is a brand new faculty member in the Department of Language and Literacy Education, where she works on issues of literacy, equity, and teacher education. Specifically, K-12 teachers work with multilingual students in the face of structural inequities, and she will be sharing a little bit more about that today. Prior to joining LLED, she worked at the Center for Applied Linguistics in Washington, D.C., Mount Holyoke College in Western Massachusetts, and the University of Massachusetts in Amherst, where she also completed her PhD. Her research has earned awards from IERA and the International Research Foundation for English Language Education, in addition to being published in numerous books and journals for teachers, teacher educators, and second language and literacy researchers. And currently, in recognition to her contributions to teachers' professional development, she holds the Ruth Crimes Academy's Fellowship from TESOL. Please share your questions and comments briefly in the chat box, and I will read them at the end of the session so Kathryn can engage with those questions and answer them afterwards. Thank you, Kathryn. We're honored to have you here. Welcome, and the room is yours.
Thank you so much. I'm going to share my screen here now. Yeah, thank you so much for that introduction, and thank you everyone for joining. I love that we're sort of getting together as so many aspects of our lives and routines are totally shaken up. I love that we're having this opportunity to still get to know one another through our work a little bit more today. So thank you so much for having me, and thank you again to the team of GAAs for sort of making this event come together. And as we're sort of doing this in this very 21st century across time and spacey way, I would love to sort of broaden Mona's invitation to acknowledge the lands that we're on, plural. So maybe if we can use the chat box here, and folks can share where they're participating from today. And if you're aware of how to acknowledge that land, maybe you can drop a line there to acknowledge it. I know lots of us are Zoom experts by now, but if you're not, you're looking for that chat icon right in the bottom of your screen if you hover over it. So while you're sharing where you are, I'll say that in my case, I am participating from quite close to campus, from the traditional and ancestral and unceded territory of the Musqueam people. And this is just where I'm participating from is just a short drive from the Camosun Bog, where the two-headed serpent you see in this picture, and you can sort of see the two heads there, was said to have originated. And as Mona was sharing some of the things, the gratitude towards the land that she's inspired by, now I'm sort of have been reflecting on this story of the two-headed serpent, which, as I understand the elders tell this story, everything this serpent passed over died, and so it left sort of behind it a wake of death and droppings. and it's hard not to sort of see parallels in the situation of today. But if you know this story, you know that in the wake of these death and droppings, something new bloomed, and it was something strong and something resilient, the musquay plant, and hence the name Musqueam, people of that rivergrass. And so I'm grateful to the lands that I'm on today for the way that they have held people through times of great uncertainty in the past and today. So let me see if I can see the chat here to see where folks are participating from. We have some folks from, let's see, oh, all over the place. This is lovely. Anishinaabeg land. We have folks from acknowledging the lands of the Squamish, Coast Salish, Tsleil-Waututh people, Dakota lands. That's wonderful. Welcome. And perhaps this is a moment where you're reflecting on how those lands are holding you today. So I titled today's talk, Conceptualizing Change in Hard Times. And since the organizing team approached me about speaking today, which was before campus closures, the talk was always going to be about change and how I've approached that in my work conceptually and methodologically, and as an anchor for sort of putting together a research agenda that's motivating. But over the last few days and weeks, as we've been getting sometimes each new day and even each new hour, this new information and new closures and new workflows for many of us, reminiscent of today, and even cash flows and family flows. These are my little team of coworkers these days. A lot of us are doing this work of figuring out how to manage personal and professional relationships that are now happening in the same space or in drastically different spaces than we're used to before. And that's not to even mention the sort of physical and spiritual toll of bodies who are contracting this novel virus, or who are sort of suffering from the effects of not so novel racism. And so I increasingly felt like we can't do this talk or this research day or this event or even our work sometimes without more compassionately approaching this concept of change and what our professional relationship is to it, particularly in the context of these incredible changes happening in our world right now. And so with that in mind, how are we going to spend this time today? Both those of us here together on Zoom right now and those who might be watching this recording later. Well, I hope that we'll sort of do it together across time and space in a way that's maybe a little bit fun, even given these kind of roller coastery times. So we'll begin by doing a little bit of a warm-up, anchoring or coming back to the interests and values that bring us to our work and I think to our ways of being in the world. And then I'll offer a little bit more of a traditional keynote piece, sharing one of my recent projects as a person who thinks about change most often wearing the hat of a critical applied linguist. And we'll have some opportunity for Q&A or dialogue in there. And then we'll close with something of an invitation for renewed engagement as we go forward into the rest of Research Day that I hope will help us make the most of the day while also just being exactly where we're at in this sort of strange time. So with that, I'd like to begin with a little bit of a warm-up. And in person, this could be something like a turn and talk, and maybe we jot down a few notes as we're chatting with one another. But I'm going to walk you through how this is going to work in our virtual worlds today. So first, I'll ask each of you to open a new tab or a new window on your computer. And you can do that by typing in that link right there, bit.ly/EDST, or clicking on the link that I just put in the chat. And I'm and that should take you to a document that looks a little bit like that picture you see there, the yellow and blue one. It says we're hearing a little bit of background noise on here, so bear with me. I'm going to fuss a little bit with the audio settings while you're opening up this window. And once you have a window open, and Vanessa, if you could let me know how the audio is sounding while I'm giving these directions. Once you have that window open, I'm going to assign folks randomly to breakout rooms of maybe about 3 to 4 people where you can discuss with other folks not recorded this question: what kinds of change do we want? So we can each sort of be queuing up that idea for ourselves. And then to get into the breakout room, you'll see a little invitation like that pop up in a moment. And when you see it pop up, you can just click join and you'll be in a small group that again, as I said, is not going to be recorded, so you're welcome to use your audio and video freely in there, however you choose. And then to sort of hold your ideas still, I'm going to ask you to create a response slide there in that shared document, where you can just create a few bullet points that capture the kinds of change you all talk about in your group. So you may be already there. If you are, this is what you're seeing in the shared document. And you can see there's a number of blank slides along the left side of the screen there. And you just scroll down until you find a blank one, and your group can capture your notes there as you're talking. And if you didn't catch it before, there's the link to the document at the top there. So now I think that you're waiting to get into a breakout room. Let me set those up now. And we have just a really nice number of participants here. So there will be quite a few different breakout rooms, 3 to 4 folks in each. And you'll have 5 to 7 minutes in those rooms to chat and create this slide. So I'm going to open those rooms now. All right. So as folks are joining those breakout rooms, if you have any questions, you can type them there in the chat, and one of the grad assistants will respond to you while that's happening. But in the meantime, I'll speak to folks who might be watching this recorded later. So hello, watchers of the future. I want you to participate in this warm-up activity too, but you're going to do it in a slightly different order. So first, since you're not being randomly assigned to a group, you'll have a chance to instead listen to a small group here sort of have this conversation. And these are folks who have consented to be recorded in this main room for you to listen to. And then afterwards, you'll have an opportunity to go into that shared slide document and add your thoughts there and see what some of the other groups were focused on in their discussion. So I'll review how to get to that shared slide thing afterwards. But for now, those of you who are left in the main room here, we have a handful of folks. I'll ask you to maybe one at a time unmute your mic and say who you are and what your role in research day is, if you're a presenter, organizer, this kind of thing, and maybe just share a word or two about your thoughts on this question. What kinds of change do you want? So I'll put myself on mute here and turn the floor over to maybe someone in the small group. Maybe Yotam or Monica can get us started.
Yeah, sure. Hi, I'm Yotam. I'm a GAA at EDST, and I'm one of the organizers of our research day today. I'll also be speaking at one of the panels. What kind of change I want? Well, the coronavirus pandemic has really shown me that the change that we need is more solidarity. And that, to me, needs to come instead of our trust in formal institutions. So the change that I want to see is more solidarity, more community, more cooperation, and less trust in institutions. Yeah.
Great. Anyone else in this main room willing to share their thoughts?
Sure, I'll jump in here too. My name is Monica. I'm a PhD student in LLED, and I'm looking forward to presenting also later on today. What kind of change do we want? It's all kinds of change are happening, whether we want them or not right now. And I think it's a really important, really critical moment in terms of the status quo has been so thoroughly interrupted. There are all kinds of opportunities to beyond just kind of surviving right now to try and really intervene for certain kinds of change. Yotam mentioned less trust in institutions, and I resonate with that and support. There are all kinds of wonderful social movement opportunities to bring about positive change right now. And we see important government interventions happening right now to take care of people who don't have certain safety nets, which I think is important change that we'll want to struggle to hang on to also post-corona, finding ways that, wow, where did all of this money come to support, you know, downtown East Side, to support low-income folks, no-income folks, how can we maintain that kind of change also institutionally, in addition to change from social movements?
That's interesting. Maria and Angelica, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, I think I feel overwhelmed with the question. There's so many things I feel I can list that have to do with structural changes that are harder and heavier to see and project, like in the horizon. And those I want to be shaken to the core, like all these violent structures that have been sustaining for so long so much injustice and inequality. But in a more personal note, I think the call on like social tissue and collective care and slowness too, and rest are things that I've kind of been forcefully connected to during these days, and that I want to keep including also once we keep adjusting to this reality we're building up now.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. You maybe aren't seeing the discussions happening on the other slides as we're chatting in here, but I think there's lots of resonance with what some of the other groups are talking about, and the scale of change is quite vast, I'm noticing, among the other groups as well. I'm going to guide our folks watching the recorded conversation quickly to the shared slide document before we invite the others back from their breakout rooms. So I'll send a quick message to folks letting them know the rooms will be closing briefly. Thank you all for sharing. Okay, now those of you watching from the EDST website and another time, just a reminder of how you'll get to this shared slide document now. Again, the address is just at the bottom of the screen there, bit.ly/EDST2020. And you can also navigate down to the bottom of the slides there on the left. And if there are no more blank slides left for you to add your thoughts as you consider that question, you can right-click on any of the slides. You'll see a menu like this, and then you can click New Slide and add a few thoughts of your own. What kinds of change are you kind of interested in at the moment in time you're listening to this? But I will say, as you're considering that question, you might want to pause the video and then come back to join us when you're finishing with your additional slide. Future watchers, you might pause now and do that shared slide task. Other folks, we're going to close the rooms and have people join us again. Okay, so over the next minute, we'll be seeing folks in the breakout rooms coming back to join us. And as they join us, I'll take a look again at some of the things that they were mentioning and reading those out. We have a group of folks not interested in any more change, right? I don't like change. I'm a bit tired of change right now. I'd like to return to kind of the place we were at before. See a really strong discussion about changes in priorities and how we approach the different kinds of change we're looking for. An interest in a post-capitalist society after Corona is showing up in our group discussions, and greater attention to global inequities. Sure, absolutely. So about 2 seconds and we'll be seeing folks come back. Okay. Welcome back. I think everyone's joined us back in the main room. Thank you all for sort of participating in that small group moment to this large group Zoom session. What interesting slides from the breakout group. I was just mentioning to the folks who stayed in this main room that it was interesting to see this sort of tension between, oh, we've had so much change, you know, we don't like change, but then on the other hand, these really inspiring reimaginations of what kinds of change might be possible at this moment. And as much as I understand EDST to be a department that captures a really wide range of interests, I'm not surprised to see that wide range of interests represented on those slides. And no surprise, a real interest in justice and equity there on the slides too. So whatever types of change it was that you contributed in your breakout room, I'll ask you to just keep in mind as you listen to me share some of my work, to sort of consciously listen for parallels or possibilities or points of productive tension for moving towards what I think we share in terms of an equity agenda. And if you have questions as you're speaking, maybe you can capture them in the chat there, and our organizers will hang on to them for the end moment. So we'll use the chat box in that way again. Okay, now I say that I'll be talking today about change from the perspective of an applied linguist. And that's right in one sense. That's sort of been my professional identity for the last 16 years or so. But as we know, it's complicated, right? And so you might hear touches of these other identities in here as I'm speaking today as well. So during the introduction, Maria Angelica briefly mentioned what I do, which is to use these perspectives from applied linguistics to think about how we can support elementary and secondary teachers in terms of disciplinary literacy teaching in a more equitable ways for multilingual learners. And in terms of scholarship, that means studying, teaching, and learning to think about how we can do that more effectively with a social justice agenda in mind. And so when I was preparing this talk, I was thinking about how would I answer that question, the warm-up question that I put to you, which was just a broad one, right? What kinds of change am I interested in, and what do I pursue in my work? So I'm going to give you a really quick backstory here. Now, I could take you all the way back to the beginning, right, when I was growing up in the Midwestern US and have my earliest memories of noticing language and difference and hierarchy. But we don't have time, I think, to go all the way that far back today. So I will take you back to a time I think most folks on this chat will know well, the early 2000s. And you might recognize some of these icons of the early 2000s, Harry Potter, which I'm revisiting with my kids now. It's crazy, it's already that old. The iPod, probably pivotal to many of our lives at that time. But if you were in linguistics or teacher education at that time, like I was in North America, these guys might have been influencing your life as much as Harry Potter was. Only what you got from them was a sort of formal and cognitive understanding of language, not magical wizardry stuff. And what you got from them was a pretty uncritical linguistics. And so in this version of the backstory, when I left university and went out to teach English in these many different contexts that you see here, I routinely experienced a mismatch between the linguistics that you see on the left and the needs and goals and the existing resources of my students who are represented on the right. And so the point of this backstory is to say that I became a bit motivated by what I now call a problem of preparation and practice. And these issues were not just the experiences of myself and my students. Our experiences I came to see really reflected some of these broader issues that are related to the ways that teaching and learning has changed in the context of globalization. For example, the fact that these new curriculum standards in the US, the Common Core, here the BC New Curriculum, are really emphasizing disciplinary literacies, and that lots of 21st century employers are doing that as well. Or the fact that changing demographics in the classroom and just general shifts in communication practices, we can see that teachers are struggling in terms of equitably supporting students. And those struggles are related to these long-standing racial ideologies and language ideologies that travel across North America. And we know work to really conjoin notions of whiteness, monolingualism, and standard English. And so then in terms of teacher education, which is the space I live in now, it doesn't make a lot of sense to keep reproducing that problem of preparation and practice that I mentioned before and graduate each year cohorts of teachers that have very little, if any, preparation related to language or literacy development or language ideologies. And so it's with that backstory in mind and that landscape, which represents hard enough times, the current crisis notwithstanding, that led me to a really specific interest in influencing three really interwoven kinds of change. Changes in teachers' knowledge about language, their beliefs about language learners, and language teaching practices. And so knowledge, beliefs, and practice, those are keywords I want you to keep in mind as you listen to the rest of this talk. Now, other folks out there have already really zeroed in on that first kind of change that I've talked about, knowledge about language. In a handful of US states, and actually even here at UBC, folks are really already in the trenches of this work. They're thinking about how to support changes in teachers' knowledge about language because of these policies that require teachers in these areas to take a course that sort of amounts to linguistics for teachers if they want to get or to keep a teaching license. And in some places that response is quite new, but in some places it's been mandated for 15 years or more, and that's really long enough for us to see some issues that we need to address if we're really thinking about these EDST type questions that I understand you all talk about and think about all the time. Is this for change? What kind of change for whom? And so one of those critiques is if we're addressing teachers' knowledge about language with a linguistics that's not really thinking about variation and equity and ideology, maybe it's not a good fit for this work. And second is the question of how does a narrow focus on language really function to help us ignore these whole histories of racial and economic and linguistic prejudice? Because if we let those go by uncritically, well, we're missing a key piece of the change agenda as well. And so with that in mind, I'll share a little bit of one of my research projects, which asks what happens when teacher educators take these critiques seriously and try to use a different perspective of language and learning and social change, and what methods can we use to research how that's working or not. And so the perspective that I take comes from critical social semiotics, and that conceptualizes language in relation to society more so than to the mind. And you can see that kind of in the layered diagram on the left there. And I built this framework out not just to make some explicit statements about language, but about learning and change as well, to really attempt to put together a conceptual framework that identifies how inequities are produced and reproduced in schools, and then to think about the kind of work that we think would contribute to change in these areas. And so the research I'll share with you is how this perspective is brought to 21st century teacher education, and especially with respect to influencing changes in teachers' knowledge, beliefs, and practices. And today I'll be focusing particularly on high school teachers, high school content teachers. And I'm going to pause before I jump into that because I see a message that the slides are maybe not changing on the screen share. So I don't know what you all are seeing. I'm seeing a conceptual framework. So let me stop this share. Let's see. Can I get a thumbs up from the folks on the video if you see some concentric circles and something? All right. Oh, there's my thumbs up. Thank you. And sorry you've missed the last few slides, and thanks for listening in that case. Maybe we'll put the slides up with the talk on that EDST website when we get there. Okay, cool. Double thumbs up. Okay, cool. We're back on with Zoom. So the data that I'm going to share with you today comes from Massachusetts, which you can see a picture of now because we're back on the same slides. And because that's where I lived and worked for a long time before coming here in January. And what's important for you to know about Massachusetts, besides that its weather is just as lovely as here in Vancouver, is that they have a policy initiative that began in 2013 called RETEL, Rethinking Equitable Teaching for English Learners, that required all teachers to take some sort of language education course, like a linguistics for teachers type class. And so the project that I'll share looks closely at how one college of education responded to this policy initiative from a social semiotic perspective, and taking a look then at what happened, right? Okay, so the questions that I was really interested here is, how did discourses from within critical social semiotics, which you saw briefly when we got our slides back on track, how did they influence teachers' knowledge about language, their beliefs about language learners, and their disciplinary literacy teaching practices? First, in the context of the teacher ed program itself when they were grad students, and then when they were student teaching and went on to become teachers. So how did it influence them over time? And so to get at those questions, let me talk to you for a sec about methodology. Put together this longitudinal mixed methods design, and I'm going to speed through it a little bit quickly so we can get to the data. Basically, a group of 55 teachers were in this course, and I looked at the larger group and then also 3 focal participants, you see there. The larger group, I had them take a couple of surveys over time and collected their coursework, and then went really in-depth and a little more ethnographic with the 3 focal participants, embedding with them across their experience. The qualitative data went through thematic coding. The quantitative data had some stats, and together what this gave me was a sort of triangulation of the findings, and also the mixed methods helped me kind of address some small sample size limitations if we just did case studies of the 3 teachers. So over the 2 years of this study, which began in 2015, I had the whole group take these surveys 3 times, a belief survey and a practice survey where they gave some feedback on student writing. And then with those focal participants, we went a lot deeper and embedded with them as they were studying social semiotics, practicing designing curriculum. And then as they moved through their sort of early professional life, we did some interviews with them and then observed them for the course of an entire curricular unit. And then did that once during their student teaching and once during their in-service teaching a year later. So what came out of an analysis of that data, and this is going to get bigger for you on a later slide, so don't worry if you can't read it here. I put together a sort of code book or a grounded description of their learning trajectories, specifically the types of knowledge that were being displayed over time as they went through the program in student teaching, in-service teaching, and the beliefs about language learners that they displayed over time. And finally, documented how their literacy teaching practices shared over time. I'm going to pause quickly to let we have one new joinee adding. Click admit. Go on here. And actually, before I move on, I think no one better than an academic audience can appreciate how nice it is when a whole 2-year study is captured nicely in one little table. So I'll sort of show you what that table captures as time goes on. But once I mapped out the types of knowledge and beliefs and practices that were arising out of this data, it was easier or more possible to notice how teachers were moving along pathways in these areas. And so I'm going to highlight 3 specific types of movement that were captured in this data and the ways that social semiotics seemed to be influencing this group of participants. The first, some measure of increased language awareness with how they were thinking about what language is. The second, some shifts in how they were negotiating language ideologies, especially with regard to what appropriateness is in terms of language and what they felt about the need for assimilation linguistically, and then also the ways that they taught language in their content areas. So before I zoom in and show you some examples of these types of movement, I do just want to say that these teachers' trajectories are not generalizable, and that's sort of not the point, is to see these boxes as fixed steps that we want all teachers to take to arrive somewhere that we think is more ideal for teachers to be. The point is just to notice the ways that they're moving here in these areas and what that tells us about how linguistics can be more usefully applied in education. So now a little bit of data. Now that first row that I showed you in the table was about teachers' knowledge about language, the kinds of knowledge they exhibited. And you can read the description there, but what's important to notice, what's interesting to notice, is that while most teachers began the course with some understanding of language as a set of rules and forms, over time they moved on to demonstrate this understanding of language as a more social construct, and maybe even the importance of context in what language is to them, and in some cases, even as something that's influenced by power, and the way that influences how different people's language is perceived. So those were the kinds of knowledge about language we saw participants exhibit. Here's one example from one of the focal participants, Lila. You can see in fall 2015 in the purple bubble. She had a pretty straightforward conception of language as a collection of words and rules, but over time, developed a sort of cognizance, that second column there, that languages sort of does vary quite a bit by purpose and audience, and even in her own content area, science, she was noting that my expectations depend specifically on the format students are communicating in, and the difference between a science report and an oral presentation really does have quite a bit to do with purpose and audience, not just a set of rules for the way things are. The other participants, made other kinds of moves along this continuum. For example, Lucas, a second participant, he began to use some of the terminology from social semiotics to understand his language use and his students' language use, saying that putting a name to it helped him see it in a new way. You can see here, he expresses, it gave me some words or theories to things that I was seeing, like how, you know how when you don't notice something until you have a name for it? Like tenor and even things as simple as code switching, I became like, whoa, I do that so much. And so for him, he came to start to use that language to understand and see and hear even his classroom in new ways. Now, Kelly, our third focal participant in this study, she was at a bit more of a cognizant place to start. So it's not as if everyone moved from limited forward, right? But in her case, she latched onto the meta language also in the same way Lucas did, but she also began to use it as this sort of more critical reflection to understand how her students' language use was being perceived by other adults in the school where she was doing her student teaching. For example, she noticed that an advising staff member and another teacher were coming to some conclusions about a student's language use that maybe didn't sit with how she was coming to understand what language was. And so she reflected on how those discourses influenced the way that student was seen in the school. And the survey data from the larger group kind of bore out a similar pattern, this movement away from limited. And for example, in these two survey items, you can see that students' disagreement with these statements grew over time. The blue bars got bigger there. In item 8, they moved away from the idea that language is mostly a matter of learning new words, or item 11, it's mostly grammar rules. And so just together, that data gives us the sense that over time, these teachers are developing some new conceptions of language and language learning. And as the study continued, 18 months later, that conception was still sort of in place. In terms of beliefs, this is the middle row in that initial table that I showed you. What's interesting here is the way that teachers began to negotiate these ideologies of standard. And I'll share just one example about where the participants started out with sort of this central focus on English. In the larger group, when we asked teachers to identify if they had any English learners in their practicum contexts, all 3 of our focal teachers initially reported, no, there's no ELLs in my class. I'm in a mainstream science class. And they all reported that if you wanted to find an English learner in the school, where you look is in a separate ESL classroom. But in fact, we discovered that all of these teachers had designated English learners in their classroom. But when they were seeing their classrooms through this sort of monolingual lens, they were sort of unaware that a student who, through a monolingual lens, they were unaware that someone with a designated English learner label might be in their classroom. And that model influenced where they think you find these people in schools. But over time, they kind of began to reconfigure these models. And what's interesting is that as they did it wasn't a straightforward movement. And that's why I encourage you not to see this sort of linearly. And they made these different moves. For example, the first move all 3 focal participants made was to adopt this kind of dynamic perspective from social semiotics that language variation is the norm for all people. And what that did for these teachers' model of language learners was to expand it so dramatically that it included all of their students in their classrooms then. So they were saying everyone here is a language learner. But for them, this tended to be a bit of a 1 foot in 2 camps moment. Because they still also perceived that all of the students in their classroom were non-English learners because those students belong somewhere else in the school. They live somewhere else in the school. And so there was a movement from this very monolingual language ideology to a more dynamic, open perspective, but it also still was complicated by the monolingual perspective. And teachers began to make different moves within this arena. And I can say more about those later if that's something that interests you, but I'll sort of go through just very briefly here for the sake of time. Lucas, one of the focal participants, said, well, it's not English, actually. That's the language of interest in this space. It's science. But in that way, setting English aside and saying everyone's learning science language here really functioned to ignore the way racism and sexism determines in-group membership in a science class as much as English or the language of science does, for example. And Kelly said, well, yeah, everyone in here is a language learner, But I think that not because language variation is the norm, but because all of my students need this more standard language variety. So at the same time that she was coming to understand language variety, she also was still struggling with how that related to standardization. Now with regard to practice, and again, I'll be brief just for the sake of time, the general shift was a movement away from form-focused literacy instruction. So initially where folks might have been sort of oriented towards vocabulary teaching or memorizing the right vocabulary, teaching the right forms in that way, over time they began to incorporate discussions about meaning making more so, and how and why people make certain types of choices in certain contexts rather than if you use these words, you're doing science language, that kind of thing. And that change in thinking and in practice sort of continued over time as well. However, it is worth pointing out, and you may have noticed this if you're thinking about the 3 rows so far, that even as much as in the first row, folks were moving towards, in some cases, a more critical language awareness, and in that sort of middle row, towards more inclusive ideologies about language, or coming into an awareness of sort of plural language ideologies, that we didn't see in this study what we might think of as critical literacy teaching practice. So there's no critical column here in terms of practice, and that is interesting, not because we don't know what critical literacy teaching in science or the other disciplines might look like, but just because it wasn't exhibited among these new teachers, even when we sort of included a critical literacy piece in their programming. And so tracing change this way over the 2 years, what can we take from it? As educators, I think we can think about how to use their trajectories maybe as a reflective tool for asking questions of ourselves, placing ourselves, doing a little bit of self-awareness work in terms of what do we think language is? What language ideologies do we hold or do we notice sort of in the waters that we swim in daily? How do these show up in our classroom practices, whether we're in K-12 spaces or in higher ed spaces? The full range of folks who are on this meeting now, and maybe how can we push into new, more critical territory in teaching and learning with that in mind, especially given what I saw in your sort of shared document questions, which is a real desire to sort of push into new, more critical spaces and thinking about what that even means. So if you're interested in this particular resource or some of the other pieces that were developed from it, feel free to email me later. I'm happy to share. But otherwise, maybe we can pause with thinking about what some of the findings point to for other pieces of a change agenda. And this was another nice feature of that mixed methods design, which is that we got quite deep contextual data that points to other needed work. Like, for example, on one level, I think the longitudinal data provides like a nice counterpoint to the short-term change data or course evaluations that policymakers often like to rely on to show that what they mandated is working. And so in some ways there's a clap back to the pat on the back movement of like, oh, social justice problems, equity problems, cool, we've got a course for it, Department of Justice, we're covered. The longitudinal data shows there's a little bit more nuance to that than course evaluations might or something like this. Conceptually though, I think if we're thinking about pushing on theory, one of the critiques of social semiotics, I think the data really bears out, is the ideology piece. There's some very, change in ideology is complicated, and it's difficult to think about how to spur in a short teacher ed program like that. But I think this data maybe points to the need for bringing in more of the folks working on ideology from a critical theory perspective. And third, even if we're sort of able to build up a more critical framework and think about how to mobilize it in a teacher ed space, I think the data suggests that the effectiveness is going to be closely tied to some of these other programmatic pieces. So if we want to talk about social justice in teacher ed or those kinds of change, we have to think about also who's being recruited into teacher education and how are folks being supported once they're recruited in. And so maybe with that in mind, since we have only a few minutes left, I'll pause here and we'll see if there are any questions or comments folks have in our last 5-6 minutes. Thinking then back to sort of the kinds of change you're interested in or questions you may have for someone with a perspective and an applied linguist. And I'll pop open the chat again.
Yeah, just a reminder for everyone, you can type your question or your comment in the chat box. If you're really eager to speak, you're also welcome to just keep it brief. We do have a couple of questions that came as direct message. One has to do, can this study teach us anything about other languages and language education in other contexts? And another one about feelings of frustration with citation styles in a way that's hard to articulate, and like maybe what can you share a little bit about that in terms of citation as a language ideology too? And
yeah, those are two actually really interesting questions. The first, I think, had to do with what can this, how can this bear on language teaching generally, not just English language teaching. And I think that reflective tool, let me see if I can, I'm not sure I can effectively go backwards and the reflection tool, I think, could be quite useful for language teachers. Quite loud ding. I think the reflection tool could be a quite useful tool for other language teachers, although I will say that English supremacy is a unique thing, even as language supremacy itself in different contexts has some similarities. But the particularity of English supremacy and language ideologies, I think, bears some study that's particular. I think it's difficult work for teachers to unpack just all the baggage that English as a language of instruction carries. So that's certainly worth thinking about. And the second question, I think, had to do about language ideologies in citations. Is that right? So I'm not sure I captured the exact gist of the question.
Sorry, maybe I can clarify a little bit over audio. It was mostly when you talked that sort of side comment about the language of science made me think about my own frustrations, but also as a librarian, I've worked with students who have a lot of frustrations in using and learning citation styles, which are very strict and rule-based, and certainly less socially constructed than a lot of other language is. And I guess I'm just having trouble envisioning change in that arena. Maybe you can speak to that a little bit. I don't know.
That's fascinating. I hadn't quite made the parallel between sort of language as a set of rules and how very deeply citation practices tend to be one of those things that we say, well, that's just the way it is, without even realizing actually that there's quite a bit of history and philosophy behind why those citation styles are the way they are. Yeah, so maybe some of the very interesting questions there would be, what's the way to sort of undo that, well, that's just the way it is, latch on citation styles, to say, well, what is the history or philosophy behind there, without also making that one more of the things that teachers have to learn in order to teach language contextually. Like, what's the moment of grip where or what's the right question that we can help students ask to sort of open that lid? Because nothing is just the way it is with language, right? If we're thinking about it from a social semiotic perspective anyway, it's grown and evolved in response to what people were trying to do with it. And so sometimes we can forget that when there are practices that are so deeply entrenched, like citation styles. So how to unsettle that concept by opening the lid on contesting any language practice we have. That would be quite interesting.
And we have two more questions maybe before we end this session. One is, as the teachers in your study shifted their beliefs, oh, sorry, I lost it. As the teachers in your study shifted their beliefs and practices, were there any challenges with integrating these practices in more traditional school settings, especially in settings where administrators or teachers may have been educated in different contexts or time periods that impacted their linguistic beliefs. We have another one that is, given the context of the study in the US, what can we learn from this study about language teaching in the US and the challenges it faces in a changing demographic? What political ideologies pose barriers to such a change? There are a couple more questions in the chat. Feel free to also read them through and see and respond accordingly.
Yeah. So to the first question, which was about what are the challenges that teachers faced when they went into classrooms of their own and into different schools. And I should mention that the schools where they did their student teaching and were first trying out these ideas were not the schools where they went on to work. And so there is also that layer of learning about a new school context while you're also trying to do these things. And that is such a key piece of the ecology of change, right? Understanding what the very situated factors are that influence the take-up of it. And over time, actually, as I've continued to work with some of these teachers beyond the end of the study in 2017, they're into their 3rd and 4th years of in-service practice in different cases. I find that administrator buy-in is actually quite a big deal, right? In Massachusetts, in that context, every teacher, administrators included, had to do some sort of training to meet that state mandate, but they got quite different versions of it, and of course are dealing with their own personal and institutional ideologies, right? So what is the piece that helps teachers manage those changing contexts? And I think there's something there about long-term mentorship and sustained mentoring that we have to think about as teacher ed programs are getting shorter, but we know new teachers move quite a bit. And that's a piece that can transport, I think, to this context, even though the study was US-based. To get to that second question about, I'm trying to scroll down or scroll up perhaps to it, about what we can learn from a US context in terms of their policies about language. Is that the gist of the question? Something quite interesting is the English-only piece at the time. At the time the study began, Massachusetts was an English-only instruction state, and the language of that policy was quite moralistic. We have a moral obligation not to speak to students in their first language if that's not English. Moral obligation was sort of the language of that policy. And by the time this study ended, the English-only policy had been overturned, although it was really so entrenched in the practices of individual schools that even though the policy had changed, it was sort of a nominal change because schools had become so set up to be English only. And so policy plays quite an important role. Now, does that policy respond well to the changing landscape of the US in terms of language or culture or ethnicity? None of these things, really. English only is quite an ideologically entrenched policy at a time when the numbers just don't bear it out as a majority thing, or even a smart thing to do if it were a minority thing. There's also one other question here, it looks like, about the use of French immersion in public education and the way it sometimes marks privilege in Western provinces, is, I understand to be the case here in BC, is a way for upper middle class parents to segregate their children. The comment is, there seems to be a tension between universal versus diverse language ed. And that's a really important piece of this language ideologies thing also, and something that I think is a really important piece for future teachers to think about, and probably current practitioners as well. Language education is never without its ideological inflection, right? Because language itself, we know to be ideologically and politically inflected. And how do we, I think this is an unanswered question, but a really important one to take up now, is how do we support teachers in unpacking the ideological baggage of language and the language of education, the way the system has been set up. And in this moment, frankly, where education is experiencing quite a bit of a shakeup in a lot of ways, does that provide any new opportunities for us to rethink the language piece of access to education in this COVID crisis, where access to education is something everyone's talking about? And I would be very interested in that conversation if there are folks interested in that. let's see, there are a couple of other questions here, but I want to just be really respectful of people's lunch break too. So should we pause and I'll take down some of these questions to follow up with folks later, or what would folks prefer?
We can continue. I mean, if you're fine with like answering and also inviting people, like I can just make the announcement I was going to make at the end, and then you're welcome to keep answering. This room will remain open, and we will come back, where we will reconvene at 12:30 to start the sessions planned in room 1 and room 2. And I'm going to send a message for these 2 links. So of course, take care of yourself. If what you need to do right now is leave the space. And also, Kathryn, you're welcome to keep answering the questions for the folks that stay here. And this room will stay open anyway, and we'll start again at 12:30.
Great, thank you. That's perfect. So feel free to pop up or grab your lunch or whatever. There are 2 more questions I'll just speak a little bit about, or 3 it looks like. Someone asked, for students that are learning language, does your study have anything to say about the pressures on students to get a job? For students that are learning language, I'm wondering if this means the high school students themselves. Does your study have anything to say about the pressures on students to get a job? Not the high school students, but the teacher education students, certainly. There is, I think there was a real tension between whether or not they wanted to complete this class and get a good endorsement so they'd be more employable in high need districts, or whether they would move on a chance to move away from more diverse districts if given the chance. And we did see that, particularly among students who, teacher candidates who had experienced more suburban schooling themselves. There was a fear to try acting out some of these new beliefs and practices because they weren't sure they would get it right. So yeah, there's a real tension between getting a job and getting the job you feel comfortable in. Which is certainly something to problematize as well. There's another question here. How do teachers beget the cultural fluidity to teach a highly diverse audience? And the direction my work is taking now is to sort of think about that as not having cultural competence in every culture of the students sitting in front of them, but cultivating a curiosity that helps you sort of manage the hierarchy of being not only the person in front of the classroom, but most often cases, the person with the most racial and linguistic privilege in the classroom. We know this about the current sort of workforce of teachers in K-12 spaces. So really thinking about how to develop a cultural curiosity, and at the same time, sort of really spending some time building out our teacher ed programs to include things like racial literacy and not just sort of formal literacy in that way. And then there's one other question. What about social justice departments walking the walk that they talk as a way to take up the work of social justice for its students, such as giving students greater voice within the department, being more transparent in their financial choices? What ecologies of change could be entered to enact such practices for administrators of teacher ed programs? This is huge. And if this is just incredibly important work. And it wasn't the direction I think my research was going when it started, but it certainly is a direction it took by the end, is that if this work that we expect teachers to undertake is going to be taken with any kind of fidelity, it has to be with a more cohesive sort of will to change at the teacher education and administration level as well. And particularly in progressive colleges of education that sort of espouse these social justice ideals and things like this, there needs to be a very specific will and concrete action plan to do the work at the administrative level also. So in addition to the things being mentioned here, giving students greater voice within the department, being transparent in financial choices, I think it means also being making an explicit commitment to the types of moves you're taking. So oftentimes there's a very vague mission statement that goes forward from a college of ed, and then behind the work or behind the scenes, there are discussions and decisions made, but being more explicit and saying, these are the concrete ways we're going to attempt to enact this mission, and being open to the criticism that may come with that. Many colleges of ed are very closed walls. There's not an openness to that criticism. And so when you cultivate a comfort with criticism also as we undertake this work. And that's at the administrative level all the way down if we truly mean to enact change. All right. And then there's one last one. Who got a chance to look at these findings? Were there any policymakers, local government authorities, ed leaders who got to interact with these experiences? Well, that's a really great follow-up question, actually. Yeah, the policy folks just got a chance to look at it last year, and there was sort of a sense of wow, maybe we need to be taking a more of a floor rather than a ceiling approach to these kinds of mandates that we're putting out there in terms of responding to Department of Justice problems, right? So the Department of Justice in the state came in and said, we're not doing a great job here, you have to do better. And I think some folks went into that saying like, wow, we'll put out this whole policy, it's a requirement for every teacher. It's sweeping, it's great. And sort of when we looked at the data this many years in, it sort of flipped that conversation to where we're saying this is an entry point. This is honestly the least we can do. And so we need to almost be thinking about this as a bare minimum, not wow, we've covered our bases now. And I know that seems like, to some, it's sort of like an, are you serious? This is the conversation being had. But when folks get removed from the classroom and removed from teacher ed, it can be startling to hear again and be confronted with what's happening. So yeah, I think the impressions were floor, not ceiling. And I hope that's sort of a lasting takeaway. So those of you still in here, the few of you still in here, I'll just thank you for hanging in here for the moment. And I'll just leave my email here at the end and share a brief anecdote that while I was typing this out, and I don't know if this is creepy or helpful, but Google was like, oh, you're going to be talking about renewed engagement? Here's a definition of renew. And it was actually so apropos, I kind of kept it. I was, wow, yeah, our work has been really interrupted in so many ways. There's so many changes that we don't want. And this seems like a really good chance to come back to it after that interruption. So thanks, Google, for listening to me and offering me this helpful definition of renew. And if you're wanting to chat anymore, of course, reach out. I'd love it.
Thank you so much, Kathryn. And yeah, just a reminder for everyone, we will now be shifting in this room to the next session that will start at 12:30 between activism and educational policy. Remember, there's a parallel room that has more brilliant presenters as well. So for now, just a small break, and yeah, we'll see you in just a bit. Remember, you can text us privately or in the chat box for everyone if there's any support you need right now. And thank you again, Kathryn, for joining us.